if you start early and you make this an ongoing conversation in your child's life, your child's risk of abuse is dramatically reduced. And I'm talking 90%.
Ever feel like you suck at this job? Motherhood, I mean. Have too much anxiety and not enough patience? Too much yelling, not enough play? There's no manual, no village, no guarantees. The stakes are high. We want so badly to get it right. But this is survival mode. We're just trying to make it to bedtime. So if you're full of mom guilt, your temper scares you, you feel like you're screwing everything up, and you're afraid to admit any of those things out loud, this podcast is for you. This is Failing Motherhood. I'm Danielle Bettman, and each week we'll chat with a mom ready to be real, sharing her insecurities, her fears, her failures, and her wins. We do not have it all figured out. That's not the goal. The goal is to remind you, you are the mom your kids need. They need what you have, you are good enough, and you're not alone. I hope you pop in earbuds, somehow sneak away, and get ready to hear some hope from the trenches. You belong here, friend. We're so glad you're here. Hey, it's Danielle. I am so glad you're tuning in today. This one is a topic that is incredibly important, and I know if you are listening to this podcast, it's probably already been on your mind, but I wanted to connect you with a really amazing resource and help you feel more equipped and empowered so that you can have these conversations with your kids. Today, I am talking to Rosalia Rivera, consent educator and child sexual abuse prevention specialist, TEDx speaker, founder of Consent Parenting, and the host of the About Consent podcast. She is also a child sexual abuse survivor, thriver, and warrior. And today, we are just barely scratching the surface on all of the ways that you need to be educated as a parent in this day and age to help prevent your child from becoming a statistic, and we dive right in. Now, this conversation does not get super, super deep. It is very hopeful. There are next steps and things that you can do. So I don't want you to be deterred by the heaviness of this topic. I really feel like it's accessible and it is something that every parent needs to hear and figure out the answers to their questions, because this is a really, really important topic. But Rosalia is a wealth of information, and her resources, free and paid, are ready for you at every stage of this journey. So I couldn't not talk about this topic, and I wanted to make sure that we covered the main things. We cover how she got into this work, the statistics that are most important to know, how to brace yourself for these uncomfortable conversations, and some of the progression leading up to online safety of the things you need to be talking about offline, and how to find resources for those conversations. Even if you haven't had specific conversations with your child yet, if you are establishing healthy communication and trust in your relationship, then you are doing great. So find the one thing that speaks to you in your place in your journey, and then connect with a next step that helps you feel confident and empowered that you are setting you and your family up for success and preventing abuse from being in your child's story. If it already is in your family's story, Rosalia has resources for you as well. So go connect with her platform, consentparenting.com, and follow her on Instagram and while you listen, and let me know what you think of this episode. Okay, so before we dive into this episode, I wanted to share with you a recent testimonial that I got back from a family that worked with me through Sandy and Solutions coaching for the last 4 months. Their main hesitation with starting coaching was the expense in general. She said, our budget is tight, so we wanted to make sure whatever program we went with would be worth the expenditure. Now that we have completed the coaching program, I can say hands down, working with Danielle was absolutely worth every penny. It will have a positive effect on our family and children for the rest of our lives. My husband and I were both stressed and exhausted from parenting 2 little kids in a pandemic while juggling work and other life challenges. We weren't staying as calm and connected with our kids as we could, and we needed support. The transition to becoming a mom for me was not easy, and I needed guidance and encouragement, especially with how to connect to and guide our strongest-willed child. Danielle provided us with a lot of tangible tools to use to help us remain calm, be better connected to our kids, and to parent from a place of love and leadership. After working with Danielle, my husband and I are more connected to each other as parents. We now have a shared vision for our parenting and family, and we work together and support each other much more collaboratively. My attitude towards parenting and motherhood has changed to a much more positive attitude, and I feel much more confident and fulfilled as a mom. I have more resources and knowledge to call on in both the good times and bad. I feel much more connected to both of my children, including our strong-willed child, whose behavior is in a much better place thanks to Danielle's help. I loved how Danielle guided us through developing our family business plan. Having kids marked the beginning of a new phase of life for my husband and I, and creating our family business plan has really helped with that transition. I only wish we had worked with Danielle sooner, so we had it from the start, but better late than never. It feels great to have created a shared vision for our family and to have gotten clear about what matters to us and how we want to live. It helps me have a sense of direction and purpose that I was needing. It also helps our whole family feel more connected and helps guide our actions and behavior in positive ways. The biggest result is that we are actively problem-solving issues we couldn't tackle before because we didn't feel like we had the knowledge, tools, or resources to address these challenges. My husband and I are talking regularly about our parenting and are working together to anticipate and solve problems and create positive situations and outcomes for our kids. We use different, more productive language in talking with our kids. We are all more connected as a family, and our kids' behavior has definitely improved. I would absolutely recommend Danielle's coaching. She's a fabulous coach. She is knowledgeable, supportive, and provides practical tools and resources that lead to concrete results. I only wish we had started working with her earlier. Thanks, Nell. Nobody can say it better than the clients that have been through it. And she's even willing to talk with any parents that are considering coaching. So reach out if you want to be connected with her, and she can help answer your individual questions as well. But if you are ready, go to parentingwholeheartedly.com/coaching and apply for a call so that we can meet each other and figure out if we'd be a good fit to work together. That's what I'm here to do. It's what I love, and I can't wait to help your family. You will be the next success story on the podcast. All right, let's dive in to Rosalia's episode. Welcome to Failing Motherhood. My name is Danielle Bettman, and on today's episode, I'm joined by Rosalia. Hi, welcome. So glad you're here.
Hi, thanks for having me. I'm excited to talk to you today.
Of course. I have followed you on Instagram for ever. You've been one of the staples, one of the ones that I just had to find right away. But I had to also share my platform with you and spend so much time diving into your insight because it's just so important. And I can't not. But before I get ahead of myself, introduce yourself to my audience if they haven't heard of you yet. And who are you and who's in your family?
Sure. Well, thanks for following me for such a long time. I love that.
Of course. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm Rosalia Rivera. I am a consent educator, a child sexual abuse prevention expert, and I help parents learn how to talk to their kids about body safety, boundaries, and consent so that they can prevent abuse. And I work predominantly with parents who are survivors of that kind of trauma. I'm a survivor and thriver of that trauma. And so I really look at this work through that lens and, help parents navigate the challenges that can come up with that, kind of trauma and doing this really important work so that they can break those cycles.
I love that. So needed in this day and age, and only more so as the days go on, it feels like.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
So the question I ask every guest is, have you ever felt like you were failing motherhood?
Oh my gosh. I'm sure everyone says yes. Because it's, there's no blueprint, right? And everybody comes from it from so many different angles and challenges. Absolutely. And it's funny because I talk about it with my therapist, and I actually have a post-it here. One of the things, I had that conversation recently, and she said, write down and journal, what is a good mom? And I was like, that's a really great question, because I think that would help us really define and understand why we think we're failing it. Like, what's the definition of a good mom anyway, right? It's kind of like asking, what's your definition of success as a career person or business owner or whatever it is that you're doing in life, right? And so it's like, that's such a great question. I have yet to fully answer it, but I think every day I probably feel like, oh, I failed at whatever that little thing was, but I have more compassion to forgive myself and do better, like just to focus on, trying again.
Yes, that's definitely one of the keys, is that self-compassion piece, because we can keep striving all we want, and as long as we wake up the next day ready to try again, that compassion gives us so much more capacity to do that. So yeah, I think it is really, truly individual and unique. Like, everyone's definition of a good mom is different.
Mm-hmm. I would just even add to that. It's additionally hard for anyone who grew up with a parent who was like a perfectionist or a control freak, and to feel like you don't have a handle on that, whatever stage of the journey you're into, because like, I think I've gotten better, but there's still always like, oh, I'm, doing this thing that my mom did that drove me crazy, and like now I'm doing it, and like you beat yourself up for that. But then you're also, just like learning to not be such a perfectionist, and there is no such thing as the perfect mom. Like, so yeah, it's an interesting ongoing, at every stage and age, like it changes. So it's interesting.
And I think it's always reassuring, I think, to hear experts in the field share, that they resonate with that feeling, because it's so easy on Instagram to feel like everybody has it together.
Totally. Totally. Especially for me, with looking at a lot of the toddler accounts, because my kids are now between 6 and 10. And I look at some of the games that, these experts come up with, and like activities, and I'm like, I wish I could have done that at the time. Like, why didn't I do that? And then you kind of like beat yourself up for the past, it's like, okay, don't go there.
Yes.
That's just a whole bag of guilt I don't need. And, you just focus on like, what can I do today? Like, what can I focus on today? And that's, the best that you can do.
Yes. I had a similar feeling last night. I was like an hour deep into TikTok, and I was feeling sad that a lot of the people that are having babies now have so much more accessibility, it feels, to having short form, like candid videos of their kids in like the really little years that they may share or may keep to themselves. Either way, it still didn't feel like that technology was available 9 years ago when I had my first. So all of our first, like her first 3 years are literally still on home videos that we haven't converted to like a DVD, and that just makes me feel real old. But I was stuck in those like, oh, I wish we could have, or that was different, and we've already lost that stage of life, and it is what it is. Focusing on today. What can I do today? I like that reframe. So, knowing that your work is heavy, and we're talking about abuse prevention, we're talking about consent culture, listeners may be coming from a different place. So if we need like a warning or a disclaimer, or like if you just want to kind of speak to the listeners as we introduce this topic in your story, what would you say for kind of like how they can reconcile their story with yours?
Okay, so I'm going to ask you a clarifying question. So what do you mean in terms of like before, if I share something that I know is going to be triggering, should I?
Just kind of like warm us up to the idea, give us an introduction. And I know like what we talked about before we got on was that everybody's approaching this topic from a different place, where they may already be like knees deep in research, or it hasn't come to mind at all.
Yeah. Yeah. So because I am a survivor and my mom is a survivor, my sister's a survivor, like it has always been something that I've known in the background, is something to pay attention to. But it wasn't until I became a mom that I understood, first of all, how important it is to talk about this with kids in an age appropriate way, but also that it's a topic that we as a society are just not talking about, regardless of where you come at it from. So whether you are a survivor who has trauma and maybe has never disclosed or has not shared it with even their partner, or they have disclosed and it's just like the trauma is there, it's unhealed, and now they have children. And that in itself can be triggering because like maybe your child is at the age where your own abuse happened and now it's like confronting you and you have to deal with it. Or you come at it from a place of it's never happened to you. You don't know anyone who it's happened to, or you know someone who's happened to, but it seems like such a distant kind of experience that you can't relate to it. So you don't really see any immediate harm or danger to your child. And it kind of gets put in the background like, okay, that's a concern for some people, but not for me. Mm-hmm. And so it's interesting how parents come to the information, like maybe the school is now teaching it and you realize like, oh, I guess this is the time when I'm supposed to be talking about it. And so I think it's really interesting the way that parents come to this information. I think we all at some point recognize whether it's like your idea of stranger danger and like I have to talk to my kids about that, and you know, or they're going to a sleepover and now you're like, is there something I should be doing, or whatever you're gonna eventually bump into this, right? Mm-hmm. And if you haven't kind of prepared yourself, or if you are overly thinking about it and you're terrified to talk about it, so at one point or another, everyone has some level of anxiety about it. And so it's interesting for me, like when I started to educate myself about it, I actually didn't even know, I had my own memories hadn't surfaced. And so that was kind of like, I got hit with this realization of the memories that I thought were either my imagination or dreams, or I couldn't like put it together, like all came to the surface. And I realized, you know, it kind of all made sense because of my sister and our history around that. And so when I started to do the work of educating myself so I could talk to my kids about it and figure out how to make sure I talked to them about it in a way that wasn't going to scare them about the world, or, you know, some parents fear like, how do I say it without taking away their innocence? You know, there's all these big questions. I realized I was being triggered overall about the topic. And I was like, maybe I just need to not talk to them about it. And like, I just don't let them out of my sight. You kind of have that like perspective of like, yeah, I just will never let them, you know, have a babysitter or like go to daycare or like homeschool them. Like, you know, you kind of get into this protective mode. And then I remembered that that's what my mom did because of her experience without getting into details, and I have permission to share her story, but her experience was with someone outside of the family. And so she never imagined that inside of the family there was any danger. So her protectiveness was always like protecting me from the outside world. And I would never, you know, I was never allowed to go to sleepovers, and I was never allowed to, you know, do all these things that my friends were doing, which backfired on her because when I became a teenager, I like totally rebelled. So, you know, that's something that I always caution parents about. But also, even when I did rebel, I didn't have any skills of body safety or consent education or awareness. So I kind of went off into the world really unprepared, you know. And so all of that information really informed my decision making on how am I going to approach this in a way that gives my kids the ability to integrate into the world in a health and safe way, while also relieving my anxiety and stress about, you know, them being in this scary world. Yeah. You know, so there were a lot of things that come to play. And I think for some parents, you know, understanding like where their perspective is of like, this has never happened, I don't have to worry about it. And then it happens. And then parents are like reeling with the aftermath. or parents who are like so terrified of it that they don't give their kids the permission to experience the world.
Right.
So that's sort of like where the core of my work stems from, is like helping parents navigate and understand the urgency of why they need to teach this, but then also like how to do it in a way that doesn't feel heavy and doesn't have to be about fear. It's not fear-based. Because of all of these, and then talking to survivors, of course, and talking to parents who have never had these issues was so different, and like helping to give them the content that would empower everybody, including the people in their circles, right? So that we can create consent culture, move away from rape culture, like really make these big shifts in society. So, so it's like, it's been a really interesting journey, and how parents step into it. And I think that's why my content is so relatable, I think, for a lot of people. It's like I talk about the fears, but I also then give you hope of like, here's what you can do. Like it doesn't, you don't have to live in fear,
Yeah.
So I don't know if that answered your question.
Absolutely.
Exactly,
yes.
But
yeah. And I feel like that's such a delicate balance. Like the two ends of this spectrum that you spoke to, of wanting to be informed, knowing that this is an urgent issue, that complete avoidance is not an option, while also not wanting to create really, really overbearing, sheltered, situations that are also just as harmful because they are unempowered or educated. But being able to walk that line, I feel like, is something that you're really good at, because your content is extremely informative and educational while always offering something about what you can do. And like, I think that when I originally connected with you for this episode, you were sharing the statistics about online predators and how it's gotten worse through the pandemic, and how, kids are in these compromising situations, and you gave stories upon stories of, you can do this, you can do this, you can do this, and you can do this. And I feel like that is what we are so desperate to hear as parents, is like, we know the world is broken. We know that there's a lot that is outside of our hands, and that really feels extremely heavy sometimes. It just like, we just are underneath the wave. But then if we can get back on top, and if we can feel like we have one aspect that we have control over, or some next steps, or some ways that we're educating ourselves, that is an entire game changer. So that's why I think that you're just speaking to that so well. Yeah.
Thank you. And on that topic of online safety, and I was just doing an Instagram live today talking about how there was this bill that just came out. Senators introduced this. It's called the Keep Kids Safe Online Bill, and it's great. I'm so happy to see that our institutions, I'm in Canada, but I love that, at least in the US, and Canada is doing a lot of work too. I think across the globe, the fact that people are raising an alarm, they're like really sounding the alarm, because it isn't getting better. The pandemic has compounded the issue. And as much as we as parents do need to take responsibility, it's like, there's so much that we are already dealing with, and there's so much that we don't know. And there's so many ways that offenders are targeting children and finding ways to access them. And it like depends on your relationship with your child, if they're going to listen to you, or how much you've already taught them about offline safety that's going to translate to online safety. So I love seeing that there is movement in government and institutions, but yet there's so much work that still needs to be done there. So we always have to even balance that, And so my biggest goal is to try to find ways to give chunk-sized information that you can absorb, that you can put in, at least think about, at least consider. And it's all in stages, I think that it can feel really overwhelming, and then we just like want to shut down and like not even look at it. So I get that, and I just have so much compassion for parents. So I try to do it as in chunk sizes that are, you can chew on it at least, and then take a step. And also call in support. Like, you shouldn't be doing this by yourself. I think that that's another big part of it. And it's not just about teaching our kids. It's also about educating the people in our community, because then we create a bigger shield around our kids through a stronger, safer community. So that's another big message too that I've really been over the last year starting to put out, is that we have to talk to the people in our kids' lives, and whether it's family members or educators or coaches, medical personnel, like even taking your child to the doctor and explaining to the doctor, like, we practice consent. So can you engage with them in that way? And, giving them a tool that communicates that so that it's an easier conversation and it's normalized instead of seeming odd. Because the more we can have these conversations, the safer the world is going to be for our kids. So we don't have to just do this one-on-one with our kids. It's like, let's create this as a normal conversation to keep kids safer by everybody doing this work, not just parents, So That's the other piece that I think is important, that we recognize, like, when we talk about it with other people, we are, first of all, weeding out potential offenders and eliminating our kids from being targets, because they're like, oh, this child's being educated, not an easy target, crossing them off the list. But also then creating consent culture and normalizing this for adults, and having adults recognize child's rights. And, so there's ways that we can do it without the intense pressure on just parents and kids.
Yeah. I'm so glad you brought that up so early on in this conversation, because it is a very systemic issue. There are a lot of moving parts. There's a million other even ways to address this issue. So to put that burden solely on your shoulders is not a healthy thing to do. But when you want to think about, okay, if all of these things are outside of my control and what is, and getting really clear about where to spend your energy, I think that's also a valuable thing that you provide a lot of resources for. So I want to start off with just asking a few statistics. So, like, what do we need to know? If there is a parent listening to this that has a 6-month-old, haven't thought about this at all, what do they need to know that is like that side of the pendulum of, hey, this is an urgent issue and you do need to educate yourself and make sure that you and your family are equipped with some resources? What would you introduce them to?
Yeah. So there's some great statistics, and I'm going to start with those first, because I usually will give you these really hard statistics and people are like, oh, it's scary. But I want to start with the hopeful part, which is that if you start early and you make this an ongoing conversation in your child's life, your child's risk of abuse is dramatically reduced. And I'm talking 90%.
Wow.
Which is awesome. So yes. First of all, let's start with that. Yeah. So, and the earlier you start it, when your child is that young, it's really about, again, communicating with the people in your child's life and really starting to just educate yourself about it, so that you, first of all, aren't so scared when you have to start talking to your child and they have to start learning about it. But also you've set up the precedent of how you're teaching this in your home, how you're communicating with your child. Like, a lot of these pieces are about you communicating with the community that are going to be caregivers in your child's life. So that's the first part. And in terms of the statistics that parents need to know and that you can communicate to other adults in your child's life so that they understand your why, and I think that's really important, because we can say, like, we're not forcing Susie to hug or kiss anyone. But someone who's never been introduced to that idea is going to, potentially give you some pushback, or kind of scoff at the idea of, like, oh, that's very new age, like, parenting, or, this very, like, delicate, gentle parenting that I don't agree with. And they might just not understand why. And it may feel very discouraging to a parent who's starting to practice consent parenting and these kind of practices. So the statistics that you can share is, first of all, this issue is actually bigger than most people understand and recognize. They don't want to look at it, so most people, have no idea, right? So if you start from that perspective of, like, other adults probably don't know, it's helpful for you to be an educator, not just to your child, but to them. So in the US, the statistics range between 1 in 4 and 1 in 6 girls will be sexually abused before the age of 18. And I don't even like saying that statistic in the way that it's written, because it says they will be, and and I think that if we change the language to they could be, but if we do something about it, we can change those statistics, right? Yeah. And then 1 in 6 boys to 1 to 10 boys. So here's the thing about these statistics also that parents should recognize is that because it's such an underreported crime, that these numbers are more than likely double, because we know that children typically don't disclose until more than 5 years after the event has happened, or until they're adults. Mm-hmm. So these are, statistics are low. But if you look at it, holistically in a classroom of 20 kids, there's a possibility of, 5 to 10 kids in that class experience it at some point in their lives. And that's a pretty high number.
Yeah.
The other statistic that's really important for parents to know about is that 90%, in some cases, depending on where you are in the world, 90 to 91% of abuse happens at the hands of someone that the child and the family knows and trusts. Mm-hmm. And so, this is family members, this is peers, this is educators. I mean, if you look at, what's happening in the sports world, right? Coaches. Yeah. So it's not stranger danger. That's only 9 to 10% of these kinds of situations. It's more likely that it's someone that you and your child know. So this is also why it's important to learn about what grooming is and what those signs are to look for, and educate yourself on that. So those are the main ones that I always bring attention to. I mean, I can give you a lot more, but those are the ones that I think parents need to recognize, is that it's common. Mm-hmm. It's also has nothing to do with age, race, demographics, class status, social, economic, none of that. There are some groups where it's higher, for example, families where there's a single parent, or children who, have some kind of disability or special needs. So there are some areas where there is a little bit of a higher risk factor, but overall, this, there is no type of offender that you can say, oh, that person isn't married and they, live in their mom's basement, and so therefore they must be it's across the board. Offenders aren't just pedophiles. They are people who are married, who, and it's not just men, it can be women. It's not just adults, it's also peers and youth. That's on an increase also because of access to online explicit content that is so much more easily accessible these days, So, so those are the things that we need to be looking at and understanding, that there are higher risk factors today, especially with the access to online, where kids can, in terms of stranger danger, that's where you can find it. Mm-hmm. But a lot of times those predators can be introduced to children by other children, because that other child doesn't know it's a predator. Maybe they haven't been educated about it at home, about online safety, and they're connecting to someone that they've been talking to for 6 months. And now your child, is introduced to them because, and so they no longer seem to be a stranger because your friend introduced them.
Sure.
So there's so many ways that children can be impacted by this. And so the key message really here is, don't sleep on this education. Educate yourself, inform yourself, so that you can then teach your kids.
Yeah. And in that same lens, you're already starting to break down common misconceptions that, it's either not common or that it's someone that your child doesn't know. Are there any other common misconceptions you run into that it's always helpful to clarify?
I think that another common misconception is that schools or daycares or institutions that your child attends are safe spaces, just by their inherent nature, that, these systems or educational spaces are doing their due diligence to make sure that those people are safe. and that they're getting the right training, that the school is doing the proper screening, that the camp, is, has some safety protocols for reporting. We make these assumptions, right, that are not always true. And so it's really also important that parents do their due diligence about asking the right questions to those organizations and institutions to make sure that they are, in fact, safe spaces for kids. What are the protocols that daycares use for when a child needs assistance to go to the potty if they're transitioning to potty training? And, those kinds of questions, like, is there more than one adult? Are children interacting at different age groups, and what's the supervision there? So really asking more questions and not just assuming that they're safe spaces is also key, because offenders are going to look to work in spaces where they have easier access to children. And we hope that these spaces do their due diligence, but they don't always. And I get a lot of consultations where parents are meeting with me because the principal was, just found out that they had online content that they just got arrested for. And like, now there's this scramble of like, how do I know if my child like was in contact with this person, and, what do I do? And, or that somebody else, was a teacher assistant, and, they exposed themselves to my child, and I just happened to find out by chance, and like, what do I do now? So, we want to make sure we don't want to just make assumptions. It's important to do the work and ask. And sometimes parents think, well, it's an uncomfortable conversation, but I'd rather have the uncomfortable conversation than my child be in an uncomfortable situation.
Yep. Because that was going to be one of my next questions, is like, I think as parents, if you have had this on your mind already, whether that was from your past or not, if your child was at an age where you're already looking some things up, trying to find a book to read with them, doing the things that because it's on your mind, then you've already maybe attempted a conversation with a caregiver or with your parents or, someone that's going to be caring for them, and then felt crazy and felt like you were silly, or felt like you're exaggerating, or felt like it's just too uncomfortable, and like, we weren't raised with this, so of course there's just a whole nother level of like the emotional bandwidth and maturity that you need to have these conversations. So like all the things of what to do with your child aside, which I know you have so many resources for and we can still circle back to, what do we need to know as parents to help us have those uncomfortable conversations?
Yeah. So what I think parents need to know is that because it wasn't a conversation in the past, it's going to feel weird for the people who are receiving it, especially if they're older, right? So talking to the aunt or the grandma or the principal, who's been at that school forever, they may give you some pushback. And so we kind of have to prepare ourselves to just know that that's a possibility and be okay with it, but also prepare ourselves with some support systems. So find, who is going to support you in that, so that you can talk to them after the fact and say, oh, I knew this was going to happen. She reacted the way that I thought was going to happen. And you have a support system so that they recognize and understand, like, you're doing the right thing. People just need to adjust to the idea. They need to absorb the information. Sometimes it takes time. Mm-hmm. Sometimes doing it in writing is great because it gives them time to process what you've said and what you've shared. And then you can have that conversation, right? So kind of breaking the ice by saying, hey, I'm doing this research, or I'm learning about this. Here's some information I would love for you to take a look at or consider, or here's why we're doing these things. And, sending it ahead of time and giving that person time to process. Because sometimes to the person receiving it, they can feel like, well, why are you telling me this? Do you think I'm an offender? Or, and I think that's a lot of times the fear that people have. Like, well, are you saying that like they can't sleep over because like my kid's a danger to them? And so if we approach it in a way where we want to educate people about what we're learning, and actually say, hey, this is something that I just am discovering and I just found out and I wanted to share it with you, because maybe you want to share that with, maybe you want to start teaching your kids so that they're safer.
Yeah.
And, I just found out that it's very easy for kids to get access. It's like, here's a perfect example of how that could play out. Your child is invited to a family member's house for a sleepover with cousins. And maybe that they don't do supervised internet access, or that they're, not practicing any online safety because they probably just don't know, right? And so they've invited your child and you're like, I don't want them to sleep there because I know that there's potential, like there's older siblings or their siblings have friends that come over, and like, how do I know if my child's going to be there? And like, there's all these questions that are unanswered, right? So how do I proceed with this? And a lot of times we want to say, like, if I was just straightforward and I didn't care how they were going to respond, and I would just ask the question. So you don't do online safety practices like monitoring, internet access, or like you do closed door access, right? So your kids are allowed to play on the internet with the door closed, or, kind of the things that I put into place. Yeah, I could ask that, and I would probably receive a little bit of like, well, why are you asking that? And there might be some defensiveness. But if I approached it from the place of, I just found out that this child like got lured by, this situation happening. And I just found out that these are some safety measures that should be put into place. Have you considered that before? Like, just want to, give you an FYI, like TikTok might not be the safest thing to allow your child to use, in their room, because of these reasons, and based on their response, right? It's like, oh, well, we don't really, we're not worried about that. It's like, well, we kind of are. So I'm not sure, like, because you don't have maybe an internet filter, or you're not talking about this, I want to make sure that my child has some resources around that first before we allow a sleepover. And so kind of giving them some education and saying, like, it's not about you necessarily, like, and what you're doing, but it's really about me, my comfort level of what my child understands and knows, and what they need to know in order to be able to navigate those spaces safely. So, I mean, the nuances can change and all of that, but essentially that's kind of the conversation of like, here's what I'm learning and how I'd like to share that education with you so that you can implement it in your home. That might be a conversation that goes on many times before you're like, you know what, now I feel comfortable. Like, you've started implementing some things. I've put some things in place. You've had time to teach your child about certain things, exit strategies, for example. So now I feel more comfortable. I know my child has a way to access me if they need to. I know that they've started putting some safety measures in place. Like, now we can, So
yeah,
if we approach it from that place of like wanting to educate, I think that makes a big difference.
Yeah, I can totally see how on the receiving end, that's definitely a different conversation. Yeah. So what are some of the big pillars or tools that prevent and make your child one that's not going to be picked, because they have this big label on their forehead that says like not a good pick, what I mean? Like, what are just some of, if you could go in kind of a chronological order of a few steps that you take kind of at each age or stage that help with that process, what does that look like over, as an overall?
Yeah, so for between the age of 2 and 6, a big part of the conversation that you're going to have is about private part safety and, body autonomy. I always tell parents, have a foundation of kids understanding their rights, which is body safety around body autonomy, right? My body belongs to me, helping them understand that concept. And then to be able to understand what their boundaries are, how to vocalize the boundaries, right? So I don't feel like a hug today, Grandpa, but like, what about a fist bump, or whatever that looks like. So that's the essential basics of, of body autonomy. So that's a really strong foundation to start with. And then you can take that to the next step of private part safety. Private part safety is obviously, explaining kids about safe and unsafe touch, helping them understand those parts, right? So talking about it in correct terms, so not using cutesy names. Teaching that piece is really key. but also that, like doing that comprehensively. So spending some time there, not just like safe and unsafe touch, but also like talking about exposure, right? Nobody should be looking at your parts. Nobody should be asking you to show them, because that's one of the grooming stages that an offender can use, is like just seeing if the child will react to the fact that someone showed them a private part, like whether it was on a phone or in real life. So really getting comprehensive with private part safety is key for that age group, right? Because the more specific you can get with a child about genitalia, that if somebody were to touch them inappropriately, they can state where they were touched, right? And that's really important also the younger the child, because if they were to go to court, if they had to testify, their testimonial is now much more valid to, in a court of law, because the child really understands that they've had that education. It's not like, well, they're being kind of vague about where they were touched. And, maybe they weren't touched in the way that, or the place that they're saying, because they don't really have the language. So that's also, so it's really key to spend some time there, get comprehensive. There's some great books and tools to help you do that. But, you're probably going to bump up against questions like, why is private parts, private, and, stuff like that. So spend some time on that topic. The next part that's really important, that, because offenders look to see how educated a child is about, their anatomy. If they're not, then they know this isn't being taught in the home. Or if they're using terms that are cutesy terms, they know that there's some shame around that in the home, and parents aren't willing to talk about it, right? So that increases their likelihood that they might be a target. The other piece that is really key, from the age of basically 4 to 5 and up, based on your child's development and understanding of language and concepts, is secrets safety. So helping them to understand, like, what is a secret versus a surprise versus privacy, and understanding the concept of tricky people and listening to your gut, and then how to report, right? If something makes you uncomfortable, if you have a gut feeling that, somebody's asking you to keep even an innocent secret, like, oh, we just went for ice cream and they told me not to say anything. It didn't seem like it was a bad thing, so I didn't say anything, right? Explaining to kids, like, no secrets whatsoever. Talking to the adults in your kids' lives to say, we have a no secrets policy, including these quote unquote innocent secrets, right? That, like, if someone says, hey, let's get ice cream, don't tell your parents, otherwise they won't let me get ice cream next time. And your child knows to say, we don't keep secrets in our family, we have a no secrets policy in our family, then that offender now knows, okay, this child's being educated, right? This is a safety family. Like, this is not going to be an easy target, because they want someone that is easy to manipulate, that doesn't know, isn't being educated, and that makes them a much easier target, so that they don't get, they don't get arrested on doing things that are obviously illegal and inappropriate. So those are the really key ones that I think if parents have at least done that minimal piece, their risk is reduced. And that stuff, carries into online safety, the idea of secrets and, privacy and those pieces carry into, as they grow up. But, don't do it once or twice and then like check the box. Like, this is ongoing. There's nuances to these conversations. So you want to make sure that, you're doing it as comprehensively as you can throughout their life. Like, so it's, not about just like sitting down, reading a book and it's like, okay, they got it. Cause like, how many times do you need to repeat something to kids before they, finally do it or get it,
Right.
So just, keep that in mind.
Yeah. And I think that there's so much uncomfortableness that comes out from parents because they weren't talked this way as kids.
Right.
So it's just hard to be able to get through like your own awkwardness of saying these words out loud and becoming comfortable with these conversations and, hoping that things don't come up in a conversation in the checkout line at the pharmacy. Those things might happen, but it's definitely worth the investment in educating your kids. So it's kind of like there's the body autonomy phase, the private parts vocabulary phase, and then the secrets versus surprises phase, all laying the groundwork before online safety.
Right.
Is that what I'm hearing?
That's correct. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And even just one last piece too is that it's really also important to create a safety network for your child. So that's something that can happen from the age of 5 and up typically, because your child can participate in creating that safety network. But it's important for your child to know that there are other people that they can go to for help if for whatever reason they feel that they can't share whatever's happening with you, and if you don't have that, then they may feel trapped and not know who else they can tell. So creating a safety network that not only is just a safety network by name, like meaning, just because it's your, brother or your, grandfather, like a grandfather, that automatically that makes them a safe person. It's based on them adhering to the things that make them a safe person, right? So like somebody who would never break a body boundary, who would never ask them to keep a secret, who would help them if they asked for help, and who would keep them safe, who would help keep them safe from an unsafe situation. So kids knowing that, it's important too, because, figures of authority in a children's life typically are automatically assumed to be safe. Like I was mentioning before, teachers, doctors, coaches, we know that that's supposed to be the case. We assume that that should be the case, but it's not always the case. So letting kids know how to identify what a safe person is and the behaviors of a safe person are also important. And so that's part of how you can create a safety network, which is also key, so that in the event that a child, so helping them create a blueprint of how to access help and an exit strategy if they find themselves in unsafe situations is sort of the final piece that I talk about 7 different things that you can teach. And I kind of just gave you some of those basics, but there's more to it. And at the end of it is that part where it's like, if you were to find yourself in a situation that was not safe, here's what you can do either in the situation or after, and to know that it's never your fault, so.
Yeah. So because we can only scratch the surface, speak to the resources that you have, both free and paid, on your website, and like going forward this month, live, like how can listeners connect more with your platform and the things that you offer?
Sure. Thanks for asking. So pretty much everything can be found on my website, consentparenting.com. I have various workshops that, anything from getting started with abuse prevention, kind of a guide that walks you through what to teach at different ages and stages. But I have tons of free resources. I have a PDF with the 10 signs of grooming to look for. So if your child whatever their age is, it's good to educate yourself on what those signs are to look for. So that's a free download. I have a book guide, so resources and tools that you can use to help teach this. Books are my favorite, so I have a book guide that you can download for free as well. If your child is doing sleepovers, I have a sleepover safety guide. Again, also a free download. So there's lots of different resources depending on where you're at. If your child is going to be going to daycare or preschool soon, the different things that you should be thinking about teaching and knowing to ask to your daycare, there's a resource for that as well. And then I have a private part safety workshop that is currently live. It's available for registration, and that walks you through comprehensively how to teach private part safety to your child if they're between the ages of 2 and 8. So that one I'm really excited about, because people have been I get these really commonly asked questions about private part safety. And that's, the questions that you may come up against, or that your child even asks you, that you're just like, how do I answer that? It's like, never thought that they would ask me that, so, and it's like, you might turn red and like, let me get back to you. I'm not sure how to answer that yet. But so this workshop really helps to dig into all of that and guide parents on how to do it comprehensively.
Thank you for creating all of those resources, because I think what you may have said at the beginning, or you didn't, is that you realized when you were trying to educate yourself that you didn't find the resources that were specifically designed at least for survivors and making things digestible and in these pieces, and just being able to create more of a hopeful framework for wanting to feel equipped and wanting to know how to feel like you have the tools in your toolkit to equip yourself and to equip your child and to equip your community with just more understanding. That is just, the ripple effects are huge by just a few families taking that on in each of their respective areas.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm glad that, it's helpful. Like, that's the goal, and it's an honor to serve in that way.
Of course. Yeah. So any last parting words, anything else that we didn't cover yet that you always want to say, or something that you feel like parents need to know?
Yeah, the last thing I would say is to not allow yourself to get overwhelmed by, the fact that this is a lot. But if you do it step by step, just like anything else, we can't climb a mountain in a day. You just take steps as you move up the mountain. And it's the same with this. So as long as you're doing something and you're staying aware and you're eager to educate yourself and you have that willingness to do something, it will help and empower your family and your community. And the toll that this trauma can have on a child and, as they become an adult is significant. And I think that this is one of the reasons why there's so much mental health, so many mental health issues in the world. A lot of times stem from these kinds of traumas. So if we can head them off and prevent them, we will be giving a gift to our children. And so, you can do this, and it's possible. You're not alone. And there's people that, like myself, I'm not the only one for sure. There's so many people in the world that are doing this work that can help support you in it. So connect with them and find those support systems and know that it's possible to do this, whether you've had that trauma or not. It's important. So I'm with all of you on it, and, you're not alone. Yes. Yeah, that's such a good note to end on. So refreshing to hear as well. And yeah, even if you just have one other buddy that listens to this and backs you up and says, yeah, me too, call them after you talk to daycare and let me know how that conversation went, and we can go back and forth and, validate each other. That's what you need to keep going sometimes, and to feel like this is the right thing to do, and you are, being a good parent or a good mom, whatever that means to you. Right, right. So the very last thing I ask every guest is, how are you the mom that your kids need? I am more playful than my mom was with me, and that's something that I actually had to work on. But it's been joyful, and it's such a great way for us to connect on a deeper level. And so I think that adding playfulness to my connection with them has been what they needed and what they continue to seek. So I think that it's good. It's a good sign that that's what they're happy to be getting from me. Yes. So they're lucky to have you. Thanks again for your time. Thanks again for your resources. Thank you. I'll put all of that in the show notes, and keep up the hard work. We appreciate it. Thank you. I appreciate you. Okay, so I feel like that was only part 1 of like 1,000. So obviously we could only scratch the surface with this topic, but I wanted to make sure it was on your radar and that you felt like you were pointed in the direction of more resources, so that you feel like you know where to go and what to do with this all-important topic. So if you haven't yet in this conversation, go find Rosalia's resources, her website, her Instagram, and find the next step for your family. Depending on where you're at in this journey, how old your kids are, there's always going to be one probably resource of hers that's going to be the right fit right now. Maybe it's the private parts workshop that she has coming up in March. Just let me know if that was helpful, and if we
do more parts on this topic. For me, I know it's always on my heart and something I've wanted to continue to learn about because it's an ongoing conversation. So if you are worried about that as well, you are a good parent. You are doing the right thing by having these uncomfortable conversations and trying to figure this out together for your kids. Great job. It is worth the effort. Absolutely. If you're enjoying these conversations, if you have been loving Failing Motherhood, please share it with a friend and leave a review on Apple Podcasts or rate it on Spotify so more moms can find it. Thanks for coming on this journey with me. I believe in you and I'm cheering you on.